Welcome to session 85 of the Worlds of Speculative Fiction series. This time around, we are looking at the first two books of this gigantic series by Tad Williams, typically called the Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn Trilogy, sometimes also called the Osten Ard books. But as we're going to talk about in a bit, there have been some recent additions to the series. So we're looking at the original trilogy, and we're not going to go through all of these this time around. We're only going to go through this much. The third book we are going to reserve for next month's session, because the third book, Welcome to Green Angel Tower, tops off at over 1,000 pages. These, we have one that's over 600 and one that's over 500, so quite a lot to go through. Now, I should mention, before we dive into things, you may be saying, well, what's Worlds of Speculative Fiction? So this is a series that we've been doing since 2016. It was a monthly series, meeting in person at the Brookfield Public Library, hosted there. And then in 2020, when the COVID lockdowns occurred, we found a new way to do this, which is exactly what you're seeing here, where we premiere a video and we do some live chat, which is always nice. And then we follow it up with a video conferencing session that allows us to continue the conversation, makes it a little bit less me presenting and people responding, and we get to have a genuine conversation about it. And we typically do this every month. We've been on hold a little bit because we moved, and there was a lot going on. So, we're here in the new office. And the other thing was, I wanted to actually have enough time to give these books the justice that they deserve, because they are some pretty weighty, massive tomes. So we are going to go through the Dragonbone Chair and the Stone of Farewell. We've got some really epic fantasy here, quite influential, as we'll talk about a little bit later in the session. And along with To Green Angel Tower, it comprises this gigantic fantasy series that comes out starting in the late 80s. Dragonbone Chair is 1988. And so these things are coming out at a very interesting time, which we'll also talk about. So what do we do in these sessions? Typically, if we haven't covered an author already, we'll do a little bit of biography and talking about where these particular books fit into the overall oeuvre, or set of works or corpus of the author. In the case of Williams, there's quite a lot out there at this point, including more books set in this milieu, which maybe we'll get to another year. We'll also talk about world building itself. This is a pretty rich fantasy world, which has also been influential on other later fantasy writers. We'll talk about how the books were received, and we'll go into some of the philosophical themes that are bound up in it, some of the ways in which, for example, Williams is taking traditional fantasy tropes and, while not deviating from them in, really significant ways, for example, that of the Dark Lord who is in shadow, perhaps coming out of the north, or, something like that, he's also doing something different with them. And so we got a lot to try to cover. We'll see how much we can pack in. I'm glad that you're coming along for this ride. Before we get going, I'm also going to say on a personal note that, this is a set of works that were recommended by viewers. Every year I solicit suggestions about what we ought to cover in the worlds of speculative fiction. I leave a couple slots open. I always pick about 9 or so, but I leave some open for fans and participants to give me some input. And this is one that came up and people were quite interested in me covering it. So we're going to take 2 sessions going through these first 2 books of the trilogy and then finally the 3rd book of the trilogy. And I will say this, as it has been the case with several other authors, the very beginning of the series is kind of a slog, kind of a, as they say, slow burn. I wasn't really that into it until we got, I would say, at least 150 pages in. But then it starts really picking up, and you see what's going on, and it's captivated me. I have really enjoyed reading through these books, and I'm going to really enjoy talking with you about some of the cool features of them. So that's probably enough on my end. Why don't we jump right in? And we're actually going to begin in kind of an unusual way this time around. I think that with this particular trilogy and series where there's so much world building that we're going to talk about in greater depth in just a bit, it might be helpful to begin in a way that I haven't done before, but I'm going to try it out. And it might turn out to be a little bit boring depending on how you look at it or how my reading goes, but it also might turn out to be very, very interesting and illuminating, especially if this is a new series to you, if you haven't already read your way through it. By the way, I do really recommend that you check this out if you're into epic fantasy. So Williams, in the 3rd book to Green Angel Tower, he provides us very helpfully with 2 synopses. And he did that before, by the way, in Stone of Farewell. He gives us a synopsis of the previous book. And so, that's kind of nice to do, the Dragonbone Chair. Maybe I'll just read it out of that one, and then we'll go to the synopsis of this book in the other big book. So, bear with me. This will indeed be quite helpful, I think, not just for those who haven't read the books, but also those who have. We get to hear Williams himself, a master storyteller, telling us the story of his story that he has wrought. So here is the synopsis of the Dragonbone Chair. For eons, the Hayholt belonged to the immortal Scythi, but they had fled the great castle before the onslaught of mankind. Men have long ruled this greatest of strongholds, and the rest of Osten Ard as well. Prester John, High King of all the nations of men, is its most recent master. After a long, early life of triumph and glory, he has provided over decades of peace from his skeletal throne, the Dragonbone Chair. Simon, an awkward 14-year-old, is one of the Hayholt scullions. His parents are dead. His only real family, the chambermaids and their stern mistress, Rachel the Dragon. When Simon can escape his kitchen work, he steals away to the cluttered chambers of Dr. Morganus, the castle's eccentric scholar. When the old man invites Simon to be his apprentice, the youth is overjoyed, until he discovers that Morganus prefers teaching reading and writing to magic. Soon, ancient King John will die, and so Elias, the older of his 2 sons, prepares to take the throne. Joshua, Elias's somber brother, nicknamed Lackhand because of a disfiguring wound, argues harshly with the king-to-be about Pyrates, the ill-reputed priest who is one of Elias's closest advisors. The brothers' feud is a cloud of foreboding over castle and country. Elias's reign as king starts well, but a drought comes, and plague strikes several of the nations of Osten Ard. Soon outlaws roam the roads, and people begin to vanish from isolated villages. The order of things is breaking down, and the king's subjects are losing confidence in his rule, but nothing seems to bother the monarch or his friends. As rumblings of discontent begin to be heard throughout the kingdom, Elias's brother Joshua disappears to plot rebellion, some say. Elias's misrule upsets many, including Duke Isgrimr of Rimmersgard and Count Eolar, an emissary from the western country of Hennistir. Even King Elias's own daughter, Miramele, is uneasy, especially about the scarlet-robed Pirates, her father's trusted advisor. Meanwhile, Simon is muddling along as Morganus' helper. The two become fast friends, despite Simon's mooncalf nature and the doctor's refusal to teach him anything resembling magic. During one of his meanderings through the secret byways of the labyrinthine Hayholt, Simon discovers a secret passage and is almost captured there by Pirates. Eluding the priest, he enters a hidden underground chamber and finds Joshua, who is being held captive for use in some terrible ritual planned by Pirates. Simon fetches Dr. Morganus, and the two of them free Joshua and take him to the doctor's chambers, where Joshua is sent to freedom down a tunnel that leads beneath the ancient castle. Then, as Morganus is sending off messenger birds bearing news of what has happened to mysterious friends, Pirates and the king's guard come to arrest the doctor and Simon. Morganus is killed fighting Pirates, but his sacrifice allows Simon to escape into the tunnel. Half maddened, Simon makes his way through the midnight corridors beneath the castle, which contain the ruins of the old Scythi palace. He surfaces in the graveyard beyond the town wall, then is lured by the light of a bonfire. He witnesses a weird scene. Pirates and King Elias engaged in a ritual with black-robed, white-faced creatures. The pale things give Elias a strange gray sword of disturbing power named Sorrow. Simon flees. Life in the wilderness on the edge of the great forest, Aldahorta is miserable, and weeks later Simon is nearly dead from hunger and exhaustion, but still far away from his destination, Joshua's northern keep at Naglimund. Going to a forest cot to beg, he finds a strange being caught in a trap, one of the Scythi, a race thought to be mythical, or at least long vanished. The cotman returns, but before he can kill the helpless Scytha, Simon strikes him down. The Scytha, once freed, stops only long enough to fire a white arrow at Simon, then disappears. A new voice tells Simon to take the white arrow, that it is a Scythi gift. The dwarvish newcomer is a troll named Binabik, who rides a great gray wolf. He tells Simon he was only passing by, but now he will accompany the boy to Naglimund. Simon and Binabik endure many adventures and strange events on the way to Naglimund. They come to realize that they've fallen afoul of a threat greater than merely a king and his counselor deprived of his prisoner. At last, when they find themselves pursued by unearthly white hounds who wear the brand of Stormspike, a mountain of evil reputation in the far north, they are forced to head for the shelter of Galoe's forest house, taking with them a pair of travelers they've rescued from the hounds. Galoe, a blunt-spoken forest woman with a reputation as a witch, confers with them and agrees that somehow the ancient Norns, embittered relatives of the Scythi, have become embroiled in the fate of Prester John's kingdom. Pursuers, human and otherwise, threaten them on their journey to Naglimund. After Binabik is shot with an arrow, Simon and one of the rescued travelers, a servant girl, must struggle on in the forest. They are attacked by a shaggy giant and saved only by the appearance of Joshua's hunting party. The prince brings them to Naglimund, where Binabik's wounds are cared for, and word is confirmed that Simon has stumbled into a terrifying swirl of events. Elias is coming soon to besiege Joshua's castle. Simon's serving girl companion was Princess Miramele, traveling in disguise, fleeing her father, who she fears has gone mad under Pirates' influence. From all over the north and elsewhere, frightened people are flocking to Naglimund and Joshua, their last protection against a mad king. Then, as the prince and others discuss the coming battle, a strange old rimmersman named Jarnagua appears in the council's meeting hall. He is a member of the League of the Scroll, a circle of scholars and initiates, of which Morganes and Benebic's master were both part, and he brings more grim news. Their enemy, he says, is not just Elias. The king is receiving aid from Inaluki, the Storm King, who had once been a prince of the Scythi, but who has been dead for 5 centuries and whose bodiless spirit now rules the Norns of Stormspike Mountain, pale relatives of the banished Scythi. It was the terrible magic of the Grey Sword's sorrow that caused Inaluki's death, that and mankind's attack on the Scythi. The League of the Scroll believes that sorrow has been given to Elias as the first step in some incomprehensible plan of revenge, a plan that will bring the earth beneath the heel of the undead Storm King. The only hope comes from a prophetic poem that seems to suggest that 3 swords might help turn back Inaluki's powerful magic. One of the swords is the Storm King's sorrow, already in the hands of their enemy, King Elias. Another is the Rimmersgard blade Miniar, which was also once at the Hayholt, but whose whereabouts are now unknown. The third is Thorn, the black sword of King John's greatest knight, Sir Camaras. Yarnagua and the others think they have traced it to a location in the frozen north. On this slim hope, Joshua sends Benebic, Simon, and several soldiers off in search of Thorn, even as Lagamund prepares for siege. Others are affected by the growing crisis. Princess Miramele, frustrated by her uncle Joshua's attempts to protect her, escapes Naglamund in disguise, accompanied by the mysterious monk Kadrak. She hopes to make her way to southern Naban and plead with her relatives there to aid Joshua. Old Duke Iskriminer, at Joshua's urging, disguises his own very recognizable features and follows after to rescue her. Tiamak, a swamp-dwelling Ranaman scholar, receives a strange message from his old mentor, Morganes, that tells of bad times coming and hints that Tiamak has a part to play. Megwin, daughter of the king of Henistir, watches helplessly as her own family and country are drawn into a whirlpool of war by the treachery of High King Elias. Simon and Benebic and their company are ambushed by Ingen Jaeger, huntsman of Stormspike and his servants. They are saved only by the reappearance of the Scythi Euriki, whom Simon had saved from the Cotsman's trap. When he learns of their quest, he decides to accompany them to Ermsheim Mountain, legendary abode of one of the great dragons, in search of Thorn. By the time Simon and the others reach the mountain, King Elias has brought his besieging army to Joshua's castle at Naglamund, and though the first attacks are repulsed, the defenders suffer great losses. At last, Elias's forces seem to retreat and give up the siege, but before the stronghold's inhabitants can celebrate, a weird storm appears on the northern horizon, bearing down on Naglamund. The storm is the cloak under which Eneluki's own horrifying army of Norns and giants travels, and when the Red Hand, the Storm King's chief servants, throw down Naglamund's gates, a terrible slaughter begins. Joshua and a few others manage to flee the ruin of the castle. Before escaping into the great forest, Prince Joshua curses Elias for his conscienceless bargain with the Storm King and swears that he will take his father's crown back. Simon and his companions climb Ermsheim, coming through great dangers to discover the Uden Tree, a titanic frozen waterfall. There they find Thorn in a tomb-like cave. Before they can take the sword and make their escape, Ingen Jaeger appears once more and attacks with his troop of soldiers. The battle awakens Igjarek, the white dragon who has been slumbering for years beneath the ice. Many on both sides are killed. Simon alone is left standing, trapped on the edge of a cliff as the ice worm bears down upon him. He lifts Thorn and swings it. The dragon's scalding black blood spurts over him as he is struck senseless. Simon awakens in a cave on the troll mountain of Yikanuk. Eureki and Heistan, an Anglian soldier, nurse him back to health. Thorn has been rescued from Ursheim, but Benebik is being held prisoner by his own people, along with Sluttig the Rimmersman, under sentence of death. Simon himself has been scarred by the dragon's blood, and a wide swath of his hair has turned white. Eureki names him Snowlock and tells Simon that, for good or evil, he has been irrevocably marked. Now, there's a lot, of course, that's been left out that perhaps we'll get to, but quite a great synopsis as far as storytelling goes. So that is what goes on in the Dragonbone chair. Let's turn now to the synopsis of the second novel in the trilogy, The Stone of Farewell. Simon, the Scythe Eureki, and soldier Heistan are honored guests in the mountaintop city of the diminutive Canuck trolls, but Sluttig, whose Rimmergard folk are the Canuck's ancient enemies, and Simon's troll friend Benebik are not so well treated. Benebik's people hold them both captive under sentence of death. An audience with the herder and huntress rulers of the Canuck reveals that Benebik is being blamed not only for deserting his tribe, but for failing to fulfill his vow of marriage to Siskwi, youngest daughter of the reigning family. Simon begs Eureki to intercede, but the Scythe has obligations to his own family and will not in any case interfere with trollish justice. Shortly before the executions, Eureki departs for his home. Although Siskwi is bitter about Benebik's seeming fickleness, she cannot stand to see him killed. With Simon and Heistan, she arranges a rescue of the two prisoners, but as they seek a scroll from Benebik's master cave, which will give them the information necessary to find a place named the Stone of Farewell, which Simon has learned of in a vision, they are recaptured by the angry Canuck leaders. But Benebik's Master Death Testament confirms the troll's story of his absence, and its warnings finally convince the herder and the huntress that there are indeed dangers to all the land which they have not understood. After some discussion, the prisoners are pardoned, and Simon and his companions are given permission to leave Yikanuk and take the powerful sword Thorn to exiled Prince Joshua. Siskwi and the other trolls will accompany them as far as the base of the mountains. Meanwhile, Joshua and a small band of followers have escaped the destruction of Naglamund and are wandering through the Aldahort forest chased by the Storm King's Norns. They must defend themselves against not only arrows and spears, but dark magic. But at last they're met by Giloa, the forest woman, and Lelith, the mute child Simon had rescued from the terrible hounds of Stormspike. The strange pair lead Joshua's party through the forest to a place that once belonged to the Scythe, where the Norns dare not pursue them for fear of breaking the ancient pact that between the sundered kin. Giloa then tells them they should travel on to another place even more sacred to the Scythe, the same Stone of Farewell, to which she directed Simon in the vision she sent him. Miramele, daughter of High King Elias and niece of Joshua, is traveling south in hope of finding allies for Joshua among her relatives in the courts of Naban. She is accompanied by the dissolute monk Cadrak. They are captured by Count Strewe of Perduin, a cunning and mercenary man who tells Miramele he is going to deliver her to an unnamed person to whom he owes a debt. To Miramele's joy, this mysterious person turns out to be a friend, the priest Dinavan, who is secretary to Lector Ranison, the leader of Mother Church. Dinavan is secretly a member of the League of the Scroll and hopes that Miramele can convince the lector to denounce Elias and his counselor, the renegade priest Pyrates. Mother Church is under siege, not only from Elias, who demands that the church not interfere with him, but from the fire dancers, religious fanatics who claim the Storm King comes to them in dreams. Ranison listens to what Miramele has to say and is very troubled. Simon and his companions are attacked by snow giants on their way down from the high mountains, and the soldier Heiston and many trolls are killed. Later, as he broods on the injustice of life and death, Simon inadvertently awakens the Sitha mirror Eureki had given him as a summoning charm, and travels on the dream road to encounter first the Sitha matriarch Amaterasu, then the terrible Norn queen Utukku. Amaterasu is trying to understand the schemes of Utukku and the Storm King, and is traveling the dream road in search of both wisdom and allies. Joshua and the remainder of his company at last emerge from the forest onto the grasslands of High Thriving, where they are almost immediately captured by the nomadic clan led by Marchthane Fikolnij, who is the father of Joshua's lover, Vorjeva. Fikolnij begrudges the loss of his daughter, and after beating the prince severely, arranges a duel in which he intends that Joshua should be killed. His plan fails and Joshua survives. Fikolnij is then forced to pay off a bet by giving the prince's company horses. Joshua, strongly affected by the shame Vorjeva feels at seeing her people again, marries her in front of Fikolnij and the assembled clan. When Vorjeva's father gleefully announces the soldiers of King Elias are coming across the grasslands to capture them, the prince and his followers ride away east towards the Stone of Farewell. In far-off Henistir, Maegwyn is the last of her line. Her father, the king, and her brother have both been killed fighting Elias's pawn Skali, and she and her people have taken refuge in caves in the Grianspog Mountains. Maegwyn has been troubled by strange dreams and finds herself drawn down into the old mines and caverns beneath the Grianspog. Count Eolar, her father's most trusted liege man, goes in search of her, and together he and Maegwyn enter the great underground city of Mezutua. Maegwyn is convinced that the Scythi live there, and they will come to the rescue of the Anistiri as they did in the old days. But the only inhabitants they discover in the crumbling city are the Dwaros, a strange, timid group of delvers, distantly related to the immortals. The Dwaros, who are metal wrights as well as stone crafters, reveal that the sword Miniar that Joshua's people speak is actually the blade known as Bright Nail, which was buried with Prester John, father of Joshua and Elias. This news means little to Maegwyn, who is shattered to find that her dreams of broader people no real assistance. She is also at least as troubled by what she considers her foolish love for Eolar, so she invents an errand for him, taking news of Miniyar and maps of the Dwaros' diggings, which include tunnels below Elias's castle, the Hayholt, to Joshua and his band of survivors. Eolar is puzzled and angry at being sent away, but he goes. Simon, Benabik, and Sludig leave Siskwi and the other trolls at the base of the mountain and continue across the icy vastness of the White Waste. Just at the northern edge of the great forest, they find an old abbey inhabited by children and their caretaker, an older girl named Skodi. They stay the night, glad to be out of the cold, but Skodi proves to be more than she seems. In the darkness, she traps the three of them by witchcraft, then begins a ceremony in which she intends to invoke the Storm King and show him that she has captured the sword, Thorn. One of the undead Red Hand appears because of Skodi's spell, but a child disrupts the ritual and brings up a monstrous swarm of diggers. Skodi and the children are killed, but Simon and the other escape, thanks largely to Benabik's fierce wolf, Kantakwa. But Simon is almost mad from the mind touch of the Red Hand and rides away from his companions, crashing into a tree at last and striking himself senseless. He falls down a gully, and Benabik and Sludig are unable to find him. At last, full of remorse, they take the sword Thorn and continue on toward the Sword of Farewell without him. Several people besides Miramele and Kadrak have arrived at the lector's place in Naban. One of them is Joshua's ally, Duke Iskramur, who is searching for Miramele. Another is Parates, who has come to bring Lector Renessian an ultimatum from the king. The lector angrily denounces both Parates and Elias. The king's emissary walks out of the banquet threatening revenge. That night, Paratus metamorphoses himself with a spell he's given by the Storm King's servitors and becomes a shadowy thing. He kills Dinavan, then brutally murders the Lector. Afterward, he sets the halls aflame to cast suspicion on the fire dancers. Kadrak, who greatly fears Parates and has spent the night urging Miramele to flee the Lector's palace with him, finally knocks her senseless and drags her away. Iskramur finds the dying Dinavan and is given a Scroll League token for the Ranaman, Tiamat, and instructions to go to the inn named Pilippa's Bowl in Quaneputul, a city on the edge of the marshes south of Naban. Tiamat, meanwhile, has received an earlier message from Dinavan and is on his way to Quanetupul, although his journey almost ends when he's attacked by a crocodile. Wounded and feverish, he arrives at Pilippa's Bowl at last and gets an unsympathetic welcome from the new landlady. Miramele awakens to find that Kadrak has smuggled her into the hold of a ship. While the monk is laying in drunken sleep, the ship has set sail. They are quickly found by Gan, Itai, and Niski, whose job is to keep the ship safe from the menacing aquatic creatures called Kilpa. Although Gan Itai takes a liking to the stowaways, she nevertheless turns them over to the ship's master, Aspitus Preves, a young Nabani nobleman. Far to the north, Simon is awakened from a dream in which he has, again, heard the Scytha woman Amarasu, and in which he has discovered that Inaluki, the Storm King, is her son. Simon is now lost and alone in the trackless, snow-covered Aldahort forest. He tries to use Jiriki's mirror to summon help, but no one answers his plea. At last he sets out in what he hopes is the right direction, though he knows he has little chance of crossing the scores of leagues of winter-bound woods alive. He ekes out a meager living on bugs and grass, but it seems only a question of whether he will go first completely mad or starve to death. He's finally saved by the appearance of Jiriki's sister, Aditu, who has come in response to the mirror summoning. She works a kind of traveling magic that appears to turn winter into summer. And so when it is finished, she and Simon enter the hidden Sithi stronghold of Jau E Tukunai. It is a place of magical beauty and timelessness. When Jiriki welcomes him, Simon's joy is great. Moments later, he is taken to see Likameya and Shima Oanari, parents of Jiriki and Aditu. That joy turns to horror. The leaders of the Sithis say that since no mortal has ever been permitted in secret Jau E Tenukai, Simon must stay there forever. Jasu and his company are pursued into the northern grasslands, but when they turn at last in desperate resistance, it is to find that these latest pursuers are not Elias's soldiers, but thriving folk who have deserted Fikalmi's clan to throw in their lot with the prince. Together and with Geloe leading the way, they at last reach Sesudra, the Stone of Farewell, a great stone hill in the middle of a wide valley. Sesudra was the place in which the pact between the Scythi and Norns was made, where the parting of the two kin took place. Yasua's long-suffering company rejoices at finally possessing what will be, for a little while, a safe haven. They also hope they can now discover what property of the three great swords will allow them to defeat Elias and the Storm King, as promised in the ancient rhyme of Nissus. Back at the Hayholt, Elias's madness seems to grow ever deeper, and Earl Guthwulf, once the king's favorite, begins to doubt the king's fitness to rule. When Elias forces him to touch the grey sword, sorrow, Guthwulf is almost consumed by the sword's strange inner power and is never after the same. Rachel the dragon, the mistress of the chambermaids, is another Hayholt denizen, dismayed by what she sees happening around her. She learns that the priest Pyrates was responsible for what she thinks was Simon's death and decides something must be done. When Pyrates returns from Naban, she stabs him. The priest has become so powerful he's only slightly injured, but when he turns to blast Rachel with withering magics, Guthwulf interferes and is blinded. Rachel escapes in the confusion. Miramele and Kadrak, having told the ship's master Aspitis that she is the daughter of a minor nobleman, are treated with hospitality. Miramele in particular comes in for much attention. Kadrak becomes increasingly morose, and when he tries to escape the ship, Aspitis has him put in irons. Miramele, feeling trapped and helpless and alone, allows Aspitis to seduce her. Meanwhile, Iskrim-Nur has laboriously made his way south to Quanakapul. He finds Tiamat staying at the inn, but no sign of Miramele. His disappointment is quickly overwhelmed by astonishment when he discovers that the old simpleton who works as the inn's doorkeeper is Sir Camaras, the greatest knight of Prester John's era, the man who once wielded Thorn. Camaras was thought to have died 40 years earlier, but what truly happened remained a mystery because the old knight is as witless as a very young child. Still carrying the sword Thorn, Benebik and Sluttig escaped pursuing snow giants by building a raft and floating across the great storm-filled lake that was once the valley around the Stone of Farewell. In Jau-i Tenukai, Simon's imprisonment is more boring than frightening, but his fears for his embattled friends are great. The Sitha first grandmother, Amersu, calls for him, and Juriki brings her to her strange house. She probes Simon's memories for anything that might help her to discern the Storm King's plans, then sends him away. Several days later, Simon is summoned to a gathering of all the Sithi. Amaterasu announces she will tell them of what she's learned of Inaluki, but first she berates her people for their unwillingness to fight and their unhealthy obsession with memory and ultimately with death. She brings out one of the witnesses, an object which, like Yuriki's mirror, allows access to the Road of Dreams. Amaterasu is about to show Simon and the assembled Sithi what the Storm King and Norn Queen are doing, but instead, Utuku herself appears in the witness and denounces Amaterasu as a lover of mortals and a meddler. One of the Red Hand is then manifested, and while Yuriki and the other Sithi battle this flaming spirit, Ingen Yeager, the Norn Queen's mortal huntsman, forces his way into Jau-i Tenukai and murders Amaterasu, silencing her before she can share her discoveries. Ingen is killed, and the Red Hand is driven away, but the damage has been done. With all the Sithi plunged into mourning, Yuriki's parents rescind their sentence and send Simon, with Aditu for a guide, out of Jau-i Tenukai. As he departs, he notices that the perpetual summer of the Sithi Haven has become a little colder. At the forest's edge, Aditu puts him into a boat and gives him a parcel from Amaterasu that is to be taken to Joshua. Simon then makes his way across the rainwater lake to the Stone of Farewell, where he is met by his friends. For a little while, Simon and the rest will be safe from the growing storm. And so that is the summary provided by the author himself of what is going on in these. Again, a lot that has been covered. Perhaps some of these were a little bit difficult to follow, these plot twists and turns, but we're going to come back to some of the key themes. Now, we should talk a little bit of biography, a little bit about how these books came about. We're not going to go into a full one. Maybe we'll put that off until next session. And then we'll launch into discussion of the world building and some of the philosophical themes that we find prevalent and prominent and worked out in these books. And now, as they say in the old Monty Python show, for something completely different, after that long exposition and reading of the summaries that Tad Williams himself provided of his first two novels in the Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn trilogy, we're going to look at his biography, but we're only going to be looking at a portion of it. So this is kind of an unusual, unconventional session that we're doing here. We started with that long set of resumes or summaries. Now we're going to do a very short biography, and we're going to put off the fuller biography to the next session when we're only looking at one gigantic tome of the trilogy, the third work. So we'll have a little bit more time to do that. So I want to give you kind of the high points here that I think could be useful in understanding Williams' work and motivations, and also the the reason why this series is considered important, and I think rightly so. So it was interesting to discover that he's actually born Robert Paul Williams. Tad was a nickname that he picked up and used as a literary name. He's born in 1957, which places him in his 60s at this point in San Jose, California. Eventually, they're going to move to Palo Alto, which Stanford is near. Kind of grew up around that, and he and his parents, stay in the same general area. It's very interesting to read that instead of going off to college like many of his friends did, and indeed many of the authors who we've looked at in this series, he decided he just wanted to work a bunch of different jobs. We'll, again, explore that more in the next session, but they ranged all over the place. And one of them is particularly interesting. He actually wrote a TV series pilot. So he's involved in a lot of different activities, and he's already, by the time that he's out of high school, he's already writing some pieces, which he says weren't very good, and that's kind of understandable as well. A common experience for many of us who do creative work, that the first bits of it aren't particularly good. Now, the first main publication is Tail Chaser's Song, which is not really, the same sort of thing as this massive fantasy series, but it is fantasy of a sort, right? And he submitted it to DAW, the publisher. It was published in 1985, and this would establish a relationship between him and a publisher. Also very important for authors. We've talked about this in the past, that it really does help to have somebody in your camp who wants to see your books coming out. And in the meantime, while he is working on these books in this epic fantasy series, from 1987 to 1990, he's actually a technical writer working for Apple in their knowledge engineering department. So, he does a lot of different sorts of things, including writing gigs to pay the bills, and then eventually he's able to transition and become a full-time writer. And this series is really what is going to put him on the map with respect to that. So the three books are in the Memory, Sorrow, Thorn trilogy are Dragonbone Chair, which comes out in 1988, Stone of Farewell, which comes out in 1990, and the massive To Green Angel Tower 1993, which apparently when it was published in hardcover was actually split into 2 volumes. Now it's available as one gigantic softcover volume that you can easily get your hands on. And so, this is a fairly quick succession. And, you notice 1988 to 1993, a space of 5 years to produce, a fantasy series that begins and is wrapped up, leaving plenty of threads open with roughly, at least in the current editions, something like, 2,100, 2,200 pages worth of material. So that, that can be quite a challenge. We've talked in the past about the difficulties of executing a series like this sort of thing. Sometimes the first book is very easy to do, and then there's intense pressure to continue and knock out the next books, and sometimes authors run into problems. And it doesn't appear that Williams did. And I should point out 2 things. One is sort of past to that, and one is future. So let's talk about the future thing first. And this is, again, something well worth exploring. The Osten Ard narrative universe, which we're going to talk about shortly as an exercise in world building, has recently had some literary additions, you could say. So 2017, only 7 years ago, The Heart of What Was Lost is sort of a bridge novel between the early trilogy and the rest of the series that will come next. And there's another book that comes out that very year, The Withered Crown, 2017, Empire of Grass, 2019. So you notice same sort of tempo. Into the Narrow Dark, 2022. And then The Navigator's Child this year, 2024, actually, very, very recent. And so, next session we'll look at some of the things that William says about returning to Osten Ard after we finish talking about this early series set in Osten Ard. So he's left plenty of room to explore, to add to it. And we could say, are there other authors that have done similar things? Well, think about Ursula K. Le Guin and Earthsea, right? We have the first trilogy, fairly early on in her career. And then she will return back to the world of Earthsea in about 20 years with Tahanu, Tales from Earthsea, The Other Wind, and it's wrapping up, expanding, introducing new characters, new issues, new questions, new problems. And so, we can say that as an author matures, maybe they want to return to their narrative universe that they spend so much time laboriously creating. Now, going back, so this series, in some ways, it got a lot of acclaim, and you could say that it had some wind in its sails, in part because there were other epic or high fantasy authors and series that were holding the torch, right, and keeping things going. So we could talk about Terry Brooks, we could talk about Stephen Donaldson and the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, which is a somewhat different type of series, a different problematic that is being set out, but is certainly, epic or high fantasy with evil lords and, strange creatures to meet and epic quests to go on. Neil Hancock's 4-part series, I would say, is also high fantasy, at least, if not epic fantasy. There is a quest involved in it. And, it's interesting to think about. So people classify Gene Wolfe's, Book of the New Sun as being Dying Earth, but you could also see it as high fantasy in a way as well. And, all of these authors are writing and, their works are coming out, some of them actually with Daw. And I think that's creating an environment where high fantasy or epic fantasy can be seen as something more than just for kids, or it's for thinking adults, and that's what this Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn trilogy really is providing. And when we think about where to locate this, Williams gives us some ideas and insights himself. Obviously, one of the big predecessors to this is the Lord of the Rings / Hobbit / Silmarillion of J.R.R. Tolkien. It's not the only epic fantasy out there, but certainly the most influential one from, sort of the midpoint to the not quite end point, but close to it, of the 20th century. So it's certainly part of the background in an important way for Williams. And Williams actually credits having read Lord of the Rings when he was 11 years old for sparking an interest in created worlds. Tolkien is what we call an architect, using George R. Martin's classification, where he calls Tolkien an architect and himself a gardener, and we could maybe locate Williams kind of in between. And imaginary history. There's a lot of imaginary history involved in the world building of Lord of the Rings. As a matter of fact, Tolkien goes and writes all this stuff that becomes the Silmarillion after his son Christopher Tolkien puts it together. And the Lord of the Rings is in the end of the Third Age. We've got the First Age, the Second Age, and the Third Age in there. So, there's some of that going on in this as well. He also, interestingly, says that he was very influenced as well by television and theater and music and art. He mentions watching a movie that as a kid I was fascinated with, Jason and the Argonauts, one of those early stop motion things where you see the warriors coming out of the sewn dragon teeth, skeletal warriors with their, swords trying to attack Jason and the crew and all of that. And then he also talks about comic books, specifically Marvel Comics, and specifically the art of Jack Kirby and Stan Lee. So classic age, we could say. And he said, he talks about other people influencing him, Shakespeare and Dickens. Unsurprisingly, for a fantasy/sci-fi author, because he doesn't just write fantasy, he's going to be influenced by a lot of other people who he's reading at the time. I know I'm, a good bit younger than him. I'm 13 years younger, but I'm reading a lot of those people around the same age that he's reading them, according to his, sort of reconstruction. And these would include Fritz Leiber, so Swords and Sorcery, Fafhrd the Grey Mouser, Michael Moorcock, the Elric of Meldebone stuff. There's actually not just a crazy sword, but multiple swords in there, kind of similar to what he's got going on here. Roger Zelazny, just a massive influence. Great science fiction writer, also, Chronicles of Amber. Ursula K. Le Guin, Earthsea, the Heinisch novels and other things as well. Philip K. Dick, he mentions, a very prolific author. Harlan Ellison, somebody who straddles sci-fi and sometimes horror and other genres. Jorge Luis Borges, great speculative fiction, short story, and essayist and poetry writer. Roald Dahl, who, interestingly, Roald Dahl, is he a fantasy writer? Well, yes, in a way, right? I mean, James and the Giant Peach, it's sort of a grotesque, bizarre sort of thing that goes on there. And then one really interesting influence, Raymond Chandler, he talks about, the great hard-boiled detective writer. So, these are some of the influences on him. And then who will Tad Williams influence particularly with his series? So, when you look through the literature, Robert Jordan, Christopher Paolini, who says that this is one of the great fantasy epics, Terry Godkin, all sorts of other people attribute it to him. But probably the most interesting and most important one, and perhaps actually suffers by comparison, is George R. Martin, who says very explicitly that reading Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn showed him that fantasy could be for grown-up adults, that it could be done in a way that, was indebted to and did some homage, but also freed itself of Tolkien, and wasn't just, great stories about fighting the bad creatures for young adults, but it really could be done in a way that the parts are, in some respects, looser. Now, I think that's actually unfair to Tolkien myself, but Martin and Tolkien, that's a whole other conversation that we could have. And so Martin says, hey, if it wasn't for this trilogy, I don't think I would have written A Song of Ice and Fire, which is, at this point in time, probably the series, the narrative world, that of, Westeros and Esteros, Essos rather, and then the other parts of, sometimes they call it Planetos, it probably wouldn't have come to pass. Now, I mentioned that in a certain way, Martin suffers by comparison. Well, why would that be the case? Well, if you are a reader of A Song of Ice and Fire, then you already know the answer to this, which is that we have been waiting, 10 years now for the 6th book in the series. It's supposed to be, started out as supposed to be a trilogy, then it expands to like a 7-book projected series. And, we've seen dribs and drabs come out, but we're still waiting on this long promised volume because Martin keeps doing other stuff instead. And if you wanted to compare a 7 or 8 volume fantasy, epic, high fantasy series that's also got a lot of grim aspects to it, well, Williams has the original 3 books, and then he has these other 4 or 5, depending on how you want to count them, books in the series that he actually gets around to writing, whereas George R. R. Martin, inspired by Williams, and people have actually pointed out where, well, maybe this aspect is drawn from Williams. For example, the 2 elvish kinds of races, the Scythi and the Norns. Well, the Norns look a lot like the others, and the Scythi, maybe that's Children of the Forest in Martin. So, Martin's clearly drawing some inspiration, just as Williams is drawing inspiration from Tolkien and from others as well. That's not the big problem. But Williams was actually able to execute, to draw out the series and make the kind of progress, a book every 2 or 3 years that he needed to make, whereas Martin seems to have foundered. I don't want this to turn into just a slam Martin session, but it is. So let's end this part on something kind of favorable. Williams is able to execute. He's able to plan and develop this entire series. Certainly the part that we're looking at here that runs from 1988 to 1993. And so, I think that's probably enough biographical influence stuff for the moment. Now let's actually dive back into the world of Osten Ard and talk about its peoples and places and some of the cool things that are happening there. Since this is Worlds of Speculative Fiction, we do want to talk a good bit about the world building that is involved in this trilogy, and particularly in these first 2 books. So we have this land which is called Osten Ard, and there's a number of other ways to sort of conceptualize it, but it's a coherent world that is, you could say, kind of sealed off by the north, everything getting so frosty. By the south, there's all these marshes and things like that. To the west, there's a great sea, and people came across that sea, at least some of them that we'll talk about. And then it's kind of blank on the map of Osten Ard going to the east. So all of the action is taking place within these different interconnected realms that are all part of one continent, where there's some islands as well, as we'll talk about. And I'm going to include a link to one of the more comprehensive maps. You can see it in the video description below rather than try to superimpose it in the video. But we'll talk about some of these territories and areas. So what we have here is a high fantasy world with lots of different locations for the various characters to originate from, to explore, to be trapped within, to traverse. And, when you look at the map, we've got, the typical sort of things with mountains and forests and rivers and seas and swamps and all sorts of matters like that, as well as, a great, we could call it a grass steep or a plain where one particular group of people live. And so there's, vast areas to explore. And I think it might be helpful to talk about the various peoples and a little bit about the history as we're getting it in the books. So the books start with human beings, and we start actually in the Hayholt down in Erkin land. There's about to be a change of power taking place. There's a high king, Prester John, who came from an island called Warrenstein. Some important events have taken place long ago. He descended into, a deep cavern, killed a dragon, came out with a great sword, united through a bunch of wars the various human realms. He's also known as being the scourge of the Sithi, who are the, elvish sort of people that we'll talk about just in a bit. And we already talked about a bit in the summaries that we had. And so the land has been essentially at peace, at least in the human-dominated areas, for quite some time. 60 years he's been reigning, which is an awful long time for a monarch and a power structure. There's a number of other things going on that are involved in the bringing this together. That's the very recent history. The much more ancient back history is that this was originally a land that was not settled by the peoples who are living there, perhaps with a few exceptions. Maybe the diggers were there, we're not really sure. Maybe the giants were there. It's going to turn out that later books will tell us no, but maybe they're an indigenous race or something like that. So we should begin by talking about the Sithi and the Norns, these two immortal, they can be killed, of course, but essentially immortal races. We learn about the history through the books that these peoples came over from a common place called the Garden, and they leave the Garden, they sail across the seas. As it's going to turn out, some other races are going to be coming with them. So the Garden-born arrive, and they live in Osten Ard. It's not called Osten Ard at the time, and they build some great cities, some of which are still in existence and have been taken over by human beings, some of which have been devastated or fallen beneath the sea or things like that. And so they're there for quite a long time, along with some other groups. And then the human beings begin arriving. And the human beings are different peoples. And, we have the rise of an empire that is kind of analogous to the Roman Empire, probably more to the Byzantine, the Eastern Roman Empire, which slowly over time, shrunk and lost some of its territory to other groups. And that is the Nabonese, right? We have other people coming in, and then eventually the Rimmersmen come in, and they're sort of like Norse, Viking, Germanic types. And what we see is the Rimmersmen, along with some of the others, will be fighting against these immortals, the Sithi. And by this time, the Sithi and the Norns have split off and become they were already two separate people, but they become much more separate. And the Norns live far up in the north. They don't have anything to do with human beings unless they absolutely have to. we'll see that there's some humans who do, in fact, serve them in certain ways. And then, the Scythi wind up, not being quite sure what to do about these human beings who are coming in, rather uncultured, fighting against them, taking over their territory, pushing them out. And some of the Scythi fight, some just retreat into various areas. And so there's some bad blood, not just between the Rimmer's men and the Scythi or the Norns too, but between human beings and in general and the Scythi, with the exception of one of the groups of people, the Henestiri, who are going to be quite important. Now the Henestiri or Henestir is located over in the west. And, it's interesting. Here's sort of a side note. So Williams is going to, as he's building his worlds, he is going to be taking the peoples of these worlds and modeling them, to some extent, actually a significant extent, after peoples that have existed in our world. So, I already brought up the Norse. He actually talks about the Icelandic for the Rimmers, the Rimmersgardmen. The Nabonese are kind of like the Byzantines, right? So we can go on. The Scythi are obviously supposed to be like the Siddha, the Elvish people, the fairies of ancient legends as well. The Norns, it's interesting because, as I pointed out before, the Norns are this, far northern, white-faced race, don't like human beings much. If you read Williams's stuff, and then you read George R. R. Martin and you didn't know that George R. R. Martin is coming much later, you would say, oh, wow, they really resemble the others. But it's actually the case that the others resemble the Norns quite a bit more because Williams is coming before him. And Martin is saying, yeah, I actually, took quite a bit of inspiration from this epic series. So going on. Before we talk more about human beings, let's talk about some of the other groups and races. So we learn a lot about the Scythi. They have withdrawn into certain areas. They view the giants, the Hunan, as a dangerous force that needs to be restrained. So they have hunting parties and hunt them down. They also don't get along with the Norns, but there's sort of a pact that's going on. Actually, the Stone of Farewell is where the departure took place between these two people. And so we've got these two immortal races. The Norns are creepy as hell. They, are from the far north. They seem to have, magical powers, as do the Scythi. We're going to find out that magic is not quite exactly what we think it is, and that'll be one of the themes that we'll talk about in a bit. And then we have several other important races playing a role that are not human. So we have the Draro, which are kind of like, you'd be tempted to say that they're dwarves, but they're actually, in some respect, more like, gnomes or something. They're smaller, they're a little bit more fearful. They're certainly not like Tolkienian dwarves, except for perhaps, I think he calls them the small dwarves. And they were originally peoples who were enslaved by the Scythi to work in wood and stone and metal, to build things for them, and they managed to escape. They don't want to be imprisoned by them anymore, and they're kind of a passive race, you could say. But they've dug all these tunnels, as it turns out, going all over the world of Osten Ard, even into the Hayholt itself, which is going to play a role. We learn about them in the Stone of Farewell, but we can tell it's going to play a significant role later on, because there's going to be an expedition mounted that's going to use those to some degree. We have these giants, the Hunan, who are shaggy, barbaric creatures. The Scythi hunt them. They mostly stay up in the frosty areas of the mountains. They give trouble to other people as well, like the trolls or Canuck people. We encounter the Niski when we're looking at, the sea voyage and stuff like that Princess Miramella is taking under disguise. We get to meet one of them, and the Niski are the Sea Watchers. They are these people who sing the Kilpa down. And the Kilpa are these fearsome, humanoid, seemingly partly fish, partly eel, partly humanoid creatures who emerge from the depths. They live in the deep water and they will attack ships. So the Kilpa are there to make sure that doesn't happen. And the Kilpa are quite long-lived creatures as well. So we've got all these cool humanoid races playing their parts, and they live in different places and do different things. And then we have the trolls, or the Canuck, who, we have at least one major character, Binnabuk, right, who is along for the ride, does a lot of important things. We find out about them because once they actually make their way back to the trollish land, he is in trouble and he's under sentence of death. Why? Because the laws and customs have been violated. He's an oath breaker. He proposed marriage, partnership to the daughter of the people in charge and then ran out on her. But why did he run out on her? Because he actually serves the singing man, who's going to be sort of like a shaman, but also a scholar type. And he's got to go and do this mission. And so in the end, they're actually going to not only let him go, he'll be also reunited with his proposed wife, but they will get some aid from the trolls too. They won't remain neutral. And now this is a great segue into talking about the humans, because the trolls don't get along with one kind of human being in particular, the Rimmersguard. The Rimmersguard are these people who, fight against the Henestiri, they fought against the Scythi, they fight against the trolls. There's a lot of bad blood between them and other people. They seem to have sort of a superiority complex. They think they're better than everybody else. They're also, when they leave their paganism behind and become Adonites, they become fanatics, right? And we actually get to see an interesting troll Rimmersguard friendship develop, right, in the books, sort of a typical trope. So lots of different humans. We have the Rimmersguard, who are up in the north, and are actually, in land that is not that far from that of the Norns or that of the trolls, and they often fight with others. The Rimmersguard are going to be devastating the Henestiri in this, forcing them back into caves and stuff like that. And, the Rimmersguard are obviously written in such a way as to reflect whatever it is going to be, the Old Norse or the Germanic tribes or stuff like that. And then the Henestiri, there's a clear sort of Celtic influence. It seems quite Welsh in many respects. You even think about the names of places that they have. And the Henestiri were actually allies of the Scythi. So they're looking for help from the Scythi as things begin to break down in Osten Ard. We also have another group of people that are, worth bringing up, the Thrithings men. These are clearly modeled after various horse riding, could be the Scythians, it could be later tribes that live in the great grassy areas, the Thrithings, the Steeps, and they have their own customs, they have their wagons. They actually, Joshua gets himself in trouble by taking off one of the daughters of Vorjeva, of one of the very important clan chiefs, and so they're going to play an important role. We already mentioned Naban, this empire that used to be quite extensive and has actually shrunk quite a bit. It's no longer a truly independent area. It's been conquered like many of the other places. We have Perdruin, which is right next to Naban, but it's an island. And they are sort of a lesser power who have figured out how to accommodate themselves and make themselves indispensable to everybody else, especially the Nabanese. So it's sort of like a commercial, anything goes kind of place. You could think of it that way. And then, to the south, we have the Ran, and this is this vast, swampy, estuary river kind of place. And the Ranamen officially pay tribute to and are supposed to be obedient to the Nabanese, but they're rather distant. They have their own customs, their own organization. They're an aquatic oriented people as opposed to the drylanders, as they call them. And we're actually going to learn quite a bit about them as time goes on in the books, because one of the characters is going to be one of the Order of the Scroll, and he's a Ranaman. Then going back north again, sort of to the central area, we have Erkenland, and Erkenland is an area that's kind of composite. It's not one people, although people can be identified as Erkenlanders. It's more about living in that area rather than having an ethnicity. They originally were sort of, part of the Nabanese Empire. It's the heart of Prester John's high kingdom. After he comes from Warrenstein, this island, and he brings with him not just his military might, but his language from Warrenstein becomes Western, the Western language that ends up dominating the area. So we've got all this interesting stuff going on. All of this is starting to break down as the story is being told. The High Kingdom, after Prester John dies and Elias ascends to the throne, Elias has, through Pyrates, this counselor, this alchemist, this wizard, he was part of the church, but now is actually sort of an opponent of the church. He makes a deal with the Norns. And so this is a way for the Norns and for the Storm King, who we'll talk about shortly, to be able to not just interfere with and, sort of bring chaos into the human kingdoms, but for them to get revenge on the humans for all of these things that they did back in the day to these immortal peoples who had come there first from the garden. Elias thinks that he's using his allies. His allies, of course, think that they're using him. Pyrates is the go-between who thinks he's using everybody, and things fall apart, People start fighting against each other, start competing, start, trying to subvert each other, undermining each other. And I should talk, when we think about this, about religion as well, because central to this story for the human beings is a church. And it looks suspiciously like the medieval Catholic Church, but there's some interesting twists and differences. The founding figure is a guy, Osiris Adon, so it's called the Adonite religion. And he was, whatever you want to call him, a savior, a prophet, a sort of godlike figure who ends up being not crucified as such, but hung, not on a cross, but on a tree. And there are saints and bishops and monasteries and nuns and monks, and so, holy days. It's sort of like Christianity with a couple twists here and there, right? And so what we actually have, which is quite fascinating, is this contrast between Adonites, not Christians, and pagans. And it uses the word pagan, right? So some of the peoples still have their, let's call them ancestral religions, and are practicing them, and others, it's been replaced by the Adonite religion. Simon himself is an Adonite after a way, right? The Scythi don't buy into any of that sort of stuff. They, if anything, they sort of like worship the natural world and their ancestors. Worship is probably too strong of a term. There are gods for the, Henestiri. There are gods of the Ranamen. The Rimmers guard people had their own gods before the Adonite religion came in. And there's still some old believers, and then there's some pretty fanatical other people as well who are Adonites. And the Adonite hierarchy is pretty structured and vast. And Prester John used this as a way to get, sort of uniformity as much as could be there in his kingdom. And, as with the medieval church, there were all sorts of people involved. Some of them, rather corrupt, some of them true believers. There's also some other stuff going on because of the influence of the Storm King up in the north. There are these fire dancers, a new cult that arises, who will actually immolate themselves, and they're preaching doomsday coming to human beings. And the Adonite church is opposing them. Pyrates, this evil counselor guy who's making all these alliances, an alchemist, a wizard of sorts, who's allied with the Norns and with Elias, and who at one time was a person within the Adonite church as well, but he's essentially left it. He is going to pull off a kind of coup against the hierarchy of the Adonite church, and he's going to blame it against the fire dancers. He's going to kill the closest thing that we could say to a pope, the high person, the lector in charge, as well as a number of other people, and they're trying to subvert the church essentially from within. So all of this stuff is, background for the world. The other thing that I want to bring up as far as world building goes, so Tad Williams, of course, is got Tolkien in the background. And if you look at these books, one of the things that you notice is that not only do we have all sorts of like names of people and creatures, great, appendices to help us keep things straight. So you can go to the back and figure out what's what, right? But we also have guides to pronunciation. So, we've got Erklandish names, the Henestiri names and words, Rimmerspach, Nabanai, Kanak, Scythi, some exceptional names, words, and phrases. And, so the guide to pronunciation. For example, the Nabani language holds basically to the rules of a Romance language. The vowels are pronounced a, e, o, u. The consonants are all sounded. There are some exceptions. Most names take emphasis on the second to last syllable, but when this syllable has an I, it's sounded long, unless it comes before a double consonant. So, there's some linguistic stuff here. But, interestingly, Williams said, listen, Tolkien was a professor of languages. He could actually build out entire languages and incorporate them into his world. Yeah, I'm not up for doing that sort of thing. So I am just making things sound kind of Icelandic or kind of Gaelic or kind of this or kind of that. And I will say something on a personal note. Um, I kind of don't like when things are too similar to our world and then just like a name is changed. So, for example, we did Anathem a long time ago, and similar sort of thing, right? There's a church that's involved. It's not quite the Catholic Church. There's similarities and dissimilarities, and words will be changed just by like one letter or something, and you're like, come on, that's not really good world building. And so that was a little off-putting for me at the very beginning of reading these works, but then I settled into it, and I actually found I enjoy this fantasy world that Tad Williams has created. You get used to the Adonite religion. You get used to all these things that are clearly saying, okay, what would it be like if a bunch of Scythians were in this world that we've got? Or what would it be like if a bunch of Vikings were there? That works out just fine. I think he's managed to pull it off quite well, and that's because he's a great storyteller. So that's probably enough, I think, at this point about the world building. We've talked about that a lot. Let's talk now about a few really key philosophical and literary themes that play a role in this work. There are a significant number of themes that are interwoven within this grand narrative set in Osten Ard, and there's a lot of different ways in which we could enter into it. I think that perhaps one of the best ways is to talk about the most overriding conflict, which we only become aware of about, a good third to halfway through the first book, and actually a lot of people are not aware of within that world because they think of what's going on as a struggle between Elias and his allies, whoever they happen to be, and his brother Joshua, or between humans and other humans like the Rimmersgard and the Henstiri, or between different races. And then, there's other chaotic things happening. But we see that there's actually this massive plot going on in terms of the Storm King. So I actually think a good place to begin for us would be in a vignette from the Stone of Farewell between Simon and Binnabuk. Simon says, everything is a lie. And Binnabuk says, well, what's everything? And what's making it a lie? Simon says, I don't think we can do anything at all, anything to make things better. We're going to die. At some time, the troll nodded. We're going to die fighting the Storm King. It's a lie if we say we're not. God's not going to save us or even help us. Simon picked up a loose bone and flung it across the path where it went rattling into the darkness. Binnabuk, I couldn't even pick up Thorn. What good is the sword going to be if we can't even use it? How is a sword, even 3 great swords or whatever they're called, going to kill an enemy like him, kill someone who's already dead? These are questions that need answering, the little man replied. I do not know. How do you know the sword is for killing? And if it is for this, what makes you think any of us is to be the killer? Simon says, I don't know anything either. I'm just a kitchen boy, Binnabuk. He felt immensely sorry for himself. I just want to go home. The troll stood. You're not a boy, Simon. You are a man in all the ways for measuring a young man true but a man, or with great nearness. Simon shook his head. Now here's where we get to a really interesting passage. It doesn't matter anyway. I don't know. I thought it would be like a story, that we would find the sword and it would be a powerful weapon, that we would destroy our enemies and things would be right again. I didn't think any more people would die. How can there be a God who would let good people die no matter what they do? So this is raising, I'm going to pause right here, some really interesting points, right? I thought it would be a story, right? So Simon is expressing things about stories within the story that he's a part of, that Tad Williams has constructed for us. Things are not as simple as they would seem. He was wrong about this, and he's fortunate in that he has this wise friend who doesn't consider himself to be all that wise, because the wise man who he followed is, who he was apprenticed to is gone, right? But Benedict has to rise to the occasion. So Benedict says, another question I cannot be answering, the question about how can there be a God who would let all these people die, good people, and I cannot be telling you what is right for belief. The truths that became our stories of gods are far away in the past. Even the Scythi who lived for eons do not know how the world began or what began it, at least not for certain, I am thinking. But I can tell you something important. So again, let's pause on this. There's this sense of, well, if we can just figure out how everything started, we can make sense of the world that we live in. And Benedict is saying, yeah, that's not available. The Scythi don't even know. So we go on. The troll leaned forward, touching Simon's arm, waiting until his young friend had raised his eyes from the moss once more. Gods in the heaven or in the stone are distant, and we can guess only at what they intend. But you and I, we are living in a time when a God walks the earth once more. He is not a God who intends kindness. Men may fight and die, and they may build walls and break stone, but Inaluki has died and come back, and that is something no one else has ever been doing, not even your Osiris Adon. Forgive me because I'm not meaning blasphemy, but is not what Inaluki has done a thing like a god can do? Benedict gave Simon a little shake, staring into his eyes. He is jealous and terrible, and the world he can make will be a terrible place. We are having a task of great fear and very great difficulty, Simon. It may even be there is no possibility of succeeding, but it is not a task we can be fleeing. Simon tore his gaze from Benedict's. That's what I said. How do you fight a god? We'll be crushed like ants. Benedict then responds, perhaps, but if we are not trying, then there's no chance at anything but this ant-like crushing, so we must try. There is always something beyond even the worst of bad times. We may die, but the dying of some may mean living for others. That is not much to cling to, but it is a true thing in any case. And what really ends this vignette nicely is they haven't figured everything out, but they pass time in silence. And then Simon says, are you still my friend, Benedict? And Benedict says, to death and beyond, Simon, friend. So, what we see here is a great encapsulation of what is going on in this story. There is indeed something like a god, but it's terrible to be in its presence. We find out at another point that if Simon had actually encountered Inaluki himself rather than just one of the red hand, one of the undead, incorporeal servitors of this god, he would have been driven insane, right? So how can this god be resisted? This terrible being, who we're going to find out more about in just a bit. So we go back to Dragonbone Chair, and we're in this great council meeting where we're going to get kind of what we could call an info dump, and this is going to be quite important. So they're looking at the manuscript of Morganis, this great member of the League of the Scroll, who we're going to learn a little bit more about in just a bit too. And they find out a description of the blade Sorrow, right? So he says, Morganis quotes from Nisus, and the fact that he actually read at least some of Du Svavenvir, the Weird of the Soul, only confirms for me Morganis' resourcefulness. He quotes Nisus as speaking of two other great swords, two besides Sorrow. Now, Sorrow is in the possession of Elias. The Norns brought it down, and also the creature of the red hand gave it to Elias, and it's making Elias, it's sort of like working upon him, changing him over time, along with Pirates magic and the weird things that he's drinking, right? So that's one of the great swords. He goes on and he says, let me read what Morganis tells us are Nisus' own words, right? So we've got a manuscript Quoting another fictional manuscript, Benedict cleared his throat and began, "The first great sword came in its form original from out of the sky 1,000 years agone. Osiris Adon, whom we of Mother Church call the son and avatar of God, had hung for 9 days and nights, nailed by his hands and feet to the execution tree in the square before the temple of Uvenus and Naban. This Uvenus was the heathen god of justice, and the Nabani imperator was wont to hang such diverse criminals as his courts convicted from the mighty branches of Uvenus's tree. So hung Osiris of the lake, guilty of sacrilege and rebellion for proclaiming the single god, heels above head like a carcass of beef. There came that 9th night a great roaring and streak of fire, and a hurling bolt from the heavens down from the sky, and smote the temple into 1,000 shards, killing all the heathen judges and priests within. When the reek and fumes were dispersed, the body of Osiris Adon was gone, and a great shout went up that God had restored him to heaven and punished his enemies, although others said that Osiris's patient disciples had cut down his body and escaped in the confusion. The naysayers were quickly made silent, and word of the miracle spread throughout all the quarters of the city. Thus began the downfall of the pagan gods of Naban. In the smoking rubble of the temple, there now lay a great and steaming stone. It was proclaimed by the Adonites that here was the heathen altar melted by the vengeful fires of one god. I, Nisus, believe that instead this was a flaming star of the heavens fallen to earth, as happens on occasion. Now from this molten rack was taken a great piece, and the imperator's sword rights found it workable, and the sky metal was hammered into a great blade. In the mind of the scourging branches, which had flayed Osiris's back, the star sword, as I suppose it to be, was named Thorn, and a mighty power there was in it." Thus, Benedict said, the sword Thorn being passed down through the line of Nabani rulers, came to Sir Camarus, my father's most beloved friend, Joshua finished. The story of Camarus' sword Thorn are many, but I had not known before today where it came from. If Nisus is to be believed, the passage has somewhat the smack of heresy. And they go on, and Benedict says, "Allow me to share more of Nisus' writing. The second of the great swords came from the sea, traveling across the salt ocean from west to Osten Ard. For some years, the sea raiders had come seasonally to this land from the far cold country they called Izyard, only to return across the waves when their pillaging was done." These are the Rimmermen, right? "Then it was some tragedy or dire happening in their native place caused the men of Izyard to abandon that land and bring their families in boats to Osten Ard to settle in Rimmersgard in the north, the land of mine own far more recent birth. When they had landed, their king Elvrit gave thanks to Udin and their other heathenish gods, and commanded that the iron keel of his dragon boat should be made into a sword to protect his people in their new land. Thus it went that the keel was given to the Dvernings, a secretive and crafty race, and they separated out the pure and significant metal by means unknown and smithied a long and shining blade. But in the haggling over the payment, King Elvrit and the master of the Dvernings felt out, and the king did slay the smith and took the sword unpaid for, which was the cause of much later woe. In thought of their coming to this new country, Elvrit named the sword Miniar, which means year of memory." The troll finished. "So, Benedict of Yiquinac, 2 powerful swords," Joshua said. "Perhaps this dreadful year has softened my mind, but I cannot think of what significance they have for us." 3 swords, Yarnagwa offered, countering Inaluki's Jingziu, what we call sorrow, 3 great swords. "You must read this last part of Nisus' book that Morgane cited, Prince Joshua," Strangyard said, joining them at last. "Here, please, this bit of rhyme from the end of the madman's writings. When frost doth grow on Clavis Bell," Joshua read aloud, "and shadows walk upon the road, when water blackens in the well, 3 swords must come again. When Buchan from the earth do creep, and Hunan from their heights descend, when nightmare throttles peaceful sleep, 3 swords must come again. To turn the stride of treading fate, to clear the fogging mists of time, if early shall resist too late, 3 swords must come again." I think I think I understand, the prince said with mounting interest. This almost appears to be a prophecy of our own day, as if Nisus somehow knew that Inaluki would someday return. Yes, Yarnagwa said, combing his beard with his fingers as he looked over Joshua's shoulder, and apparently if things are to be made right, 3 swords must come again. Our understanding, Prince, Benedict said, is that somehow if somehow the Storm King can be defeated, it is by finding our 3 swords. The 3 swords, of which Nisus speaks, Joshua said, so it would seem. But if what the boy Simon saw is correct, sorrow is already in the hands of my brother. So Simon has seen this ritual early on in the Dragonbone chair, which is carried out, and there's a sacrifice that goes on, and the Norns deliver this sword to Elias, and it's in his hands, and it's in his hands the entire time, the rest of these 2 books. So one of the swords is accounted for. And then he says, if it were a simple thing to go and take it from him in the Hayholt, we wouldn't be cowering here in Naglamund. He says, well, we shall worry about sorrow last, Prince, Yarnagwa said. We must move now to secure the other 2. I am named for my eyes and trained sight, but even I cannot see the future. Perhaps a way will come for us to take sorrow from Elias, or maybe he'll make some mistake. No, it is Thorn and Miniar we must now find. So where are they going to find them? They discover that Thorn is up in the north, and it will in fact be Simon who will use it to kill a dragon. Well, not kill, but wound a dragon whose blood pours upon him and renders a lock of his hair white. We read this here. This is towards the end of Dragonbone Chair. Simon tried to shout Jiriki's name, but his throat caught. All that came out was a strangled grunt. Come, old one, Jiriki cried. Come to me and taste Injuru, you bastard child of Hidonhebi. Simon grimaced as he dug towards the prince. No need to shout. The dragon was coming of its own accord. Get behind, Jiriki started to say as Simon reached him. Then the Scythe abruptly pitched forward. The snow beneath him had fallen away. So Simon stopped. There was a noise like thunder behind. He whirled to see the vast white bulk of Igjaruk bearing down, head flailing from side to side with the motion of the driving legs. Diving to one side, he rolled and came up on his feet. The blue saucer eyes tracked him, and the creature, now only 100 paces away, swerved to follow. Simon realized he was still carrying Thorn. He lifted it up. It was suddenly light as a willow wand and seemed to sing in his hands like a wind-sawed rope. He glanced back over his shoulder. A few paces of ground was all, then empty air. Osiris saved me, he wondered. Why doesn't the dragon make a sound? Well, and then we find out, why should he shout at the last? He remembered what Jiriki had once said of mortals, that even as the frosty musk of the dragon blew down on him, a stench like cold, sour earth and wet stones. Here I am, he cried, and brought Thorn whistling toward the baleful eye. I am Simon. Something caught at the blade, and a gout of black blood spat at him, burning like fire, like ice, searing his face, even as a great white something crashed through and carried him down into darkness. So we see the blade in action. So we have 2 of the blades accounted for. Where is the third one? We're going to find out something quite interesting. We know that the Draros made Miniar. And so in page, here we go, 387, we find out something else that is, there we go, quite important about this. So the Draros made that blade, right? Here we go. And they're telling the story. Bitter was our curse on that blade. Closely did we watch it, though it was far from us. Such is Draro work. Nothing we forge is ever far from our heights or our sight. Miniar brought much sadness to Fingil and his tribe, for all it was a mighty weapon. He goes on and says, that which spoke was someone or something who we knew not, asking us, something that talked to us in persuasive words. It wanted to know where Miniar was. And it said, it knew we'd been the blade's makers, and it knew we Draros are bound to our work, even if it's gone, even after it's gone from us, as one who's lost a hand often feels it at the end of his arm. The thing that had gone from us to witness asked if the northern king Fingil had indeed taken the sword Miniar into Asu when he conquered that great place, and was it there still? Asua, Eleor breathed. Of course, the Hayholt. That is its mortal name, Ysfidri nodded. We were frightened by this strange and fearful voice. You must understand we have been castaways for more years than your people can dream. It was obvious that some new power had arisen in the world, but one that nevertheless did command the old arts. But we do not wish any of our old masters to find us and take us back, so we made no answer. They go on a little bit further. We knew something neither of our questioners did. Do you see, our masters think the sword Miniar never left Asua, and that is true. But the one who found the sword there, beneath the castle, the one you call King John Prester, had it reforged and made new. Under the name of Brightnail, he carried it all across the world and back. The Count of Nodmulloch whistled a low surprised trill. So Brightnail was the old scourge of the north? Fingil's Miniar? Strange. What other secrets did Prester John take to his grave, I wonder? But Ysfidril, we don't understand. Patience, the Drarl showed a wintry smile. You could never tend and harvest bulky stone as we do, you quick-blooded children. Patience. The mistress of Zidya, the Scythi, told us this sword, one of the great swords, was somehow much concerned with events now transpiring and with the fate of the mortal prince called Handless Joshua Langhand. Yes, but we think it is trickery, for she also said this sword might somehow be vital against the same evil that had driven our tribesfolk out of Hikahikio, and that same evil might soon threaten all that walked above or below ground. How could the fate of any mortal man affect the squabblings of immortals? He goes on and he says, so somehow Joshua's survival is tied to this blade? Yes, so she claimed. But how could she say his fate is tied to that of Miniar when she did not even know it had been reforged? And I will tell you another terrible thing. Maybe a great doom has come into the world. If so, we Draros have brought it on. Eolar looked around. But why, Ysfidri? Brightnail's history might be a deep and dark secret, but you Draros did not tell it to anyone. And then we find out that they have told the stranger the tale of Miniar, right? And so this is going to, lead to more urgency, but also hope, because as these characters are all being united around the Stone of Farewell, now we find out that if they can just get into the Hayholt and find the grave, they will find Brightnail, which was buried with the king, Prester John. So 2 of the swords are possibly within their grasp. Now, why do they need these? We've got this big baddie, and you might say, well, that's a typical fantasy trope. You might think of the Lord of the Rings and Sauron and Morgoth. You might think of Lord Fowl in Thomas Covenant, Stephen Donaldson stuff. But what is really motivating Inaluki? So we are going to learn the story of this. He was originally one of the Scythi, and first we have this interesting contact, right? I should bring this up. This is sort of our first encounter obliquely in the Road of Dreams, in Simon's own dreams, as Pirates is trying to get a hold of him. Pirates has kind of marked him. But, so here's Simon, right? He's dreaming. Where are you, boy? Are you dreaming? I can almost touch you. It was Pirates' voice that suddenly spoke, and he felt the malevolent weight of the alchemist's thoughts behind it. I now know who you are. Morganus's boy, a scullion, a meddler. You've seen things you should not have seen, Kitchen boy. Trifled with things beyond you. You know far too much. I will search you out. Where are you? So, That's bad, right? This is a proverbial out of the frying pan into the fire, or perhaps into the cauldron. And then there was a greater darkness, a shadow beneath the shadow of the wheel, and deep in that shadow, two red fires bloomed, eyes that must have gazed from a skull horribly full of flame. No mortal, a voice said, and in his head it had the sound of ashes and earth and the mute, unvoiced end of things. No, this is not for you. The eyes flared, full of curiosity and glee. We will take this one priest. Simon felt Pirates' hold slipping away, the alchemist's power withering before the dark thing. Welcome, it said. This is the Storm King's house, here beyond the darkest gate. What is your name? No, Simon thought, he shouted, but his mouth too was full of earth. I won't tell you. Perhaps we will give you a name. You must have a name, little fly, little dust speck, so that we will know you when we meet. You must be marked. No, Simon said. I don't want a name. I don't want a name. I don't want a name from you. And he wakes up, right? And so this is an encounter, perhaps with the Red Hand, perhaps with the Storm King at sort of a distance. And now we're going to find out about who this is, as we also learn about the League of the Scroll. So this is a very important story. Benedict says, we didn't meet by chance. Morganes and Ukuk, my master, they belong to a special group. What is it? The League of the Scroll. There are, I was told by him, never more than 7 members. You're and my masters are dead. There can be no more than 5 left. So Simon says, well, what's the League of the Scroll? A group of learned people who share knowledge. I've heard my master saying, perhaps nothing more, but he would never tell me. I'm sorry to be saying this, but we have to walk again. So what is the League of the Scroll? Well, we're going to find out much more about this a bit later on, as some of them are slowly emerging. And here we go. So the League of the Scroll was originally... here we go. The League of the Scroll is only a small story, but it fits into a larger story. We can close the door, but that does not make the snow and hail away. In the same manner, you can call me mad. This will not make he who menaces you go away either. He's waited 5 centuries to take back what he feels is his, and his hand is colder and stronger than any of you can understand. His is the larger story, inside which the tail of the League is nestled like an old arrowhead stuck in a great tree, over which the bark has grown thick until the arrow has hidden. So he says, well, Joshua says, who is this thing? What is this? And he says, your enemy died 500 years ago. The place where his first life ended lies beneath the foundations of the castle where your life began. He is Inaluki, the Storm King. Jernagua says, stories within stories. I cannot tell you the story of the League of the Scroll without you first understanding the fall of Osawa, the end of King Aelstan Fiskern. He who constructed the League as a wall against darkness cannot be separated from the end of Inaluki, whose darkness is upon us now. So we're going to do this in a somewhat adumbrated fashion because we don't have, limitless time. But let's read some of this. Long before men came to Osten Ard, the Scythi were here. There's no man or woman who knows when they came, but they did, traveling out of the east, out of the rising sun, till they settled in this land. They made their greatest work of their hands, the castle Osawa. They delved deep into the earth, laying its foundations in the very bones of Osten Ard, then built walls of ivory and pearl and opal, stretching up higher than the trees, towers that stood against the sky like masts of ship, towers from which all of Osten Ard could be seen, and from which the sharp-eyed Scythi could watch the great ocean bounding the western shore. For countless years, they lived alone in Osten Ard, building their fragile cities on the mountain slopes and in the deeps of the forest, delicate hill-like cities like icy flowers, forest settlements like earthbound boats with many sails. But Asua was the greatest and long-lived kings of the Scythi ruled here. When men came, it was as simple herders and fishermen, wandering over some long-vanished land bridge in the northern waste, fleeing some fearful thing in the west, perhaps, or merely looking for new grazing lands. So we don't even know. The Scythi paid them no more mind. They did the deer or wild cattle. Even when the swift generations multiplied and men began to build themselves stone cities and forge bronze tools and weapons, as long as they did not take what was the Scythi's and stayed on the lands the Earl King allowed them, there was peace between the peoples. Even the empire of Naban in itself, glorious in its arts and arms that put all mortal men of Osten Ard beneath its long shadow, caused no concern to the Scythi or their king. He goes on, what must be spoken of is the march of King Fingal down out of the north and the fall of Asua. 5 long centuries have covered much of the story with debris of time and ignorance. But when Aelstan the Fisher King chartered our league 200 years ago, it was to find and preserve such knowledge. At the Battle of the Knock and Samrath Plain and in the Utenwash, at one place and another, Fingal and his armies triumphed and drew the noose tight around Asua. The Scythi lost their last human allies at the Summerfield, Samrath, and with the Henstery routed, there were none among the Scythi who could stand against northern iron. They go on as well. Asua, even though its walls were bound with old and powerful magics, there was still a sense that things were at their ending. So the king dressed himself in all mourning white, and with his queen Amarasu spent the long days of Fingal's siege, which quickly became months, then years, listening to melancholy music and the poetry of the Scythi's brighter days in Osten Ard. There was one among the Scythi who wished it otherwise, and was not content to spend his last days keening over lost peace and ravaged innocence. He was Iugnato's son, and his name was Inaluki. Right? So what did Inaluki do? His name is Bright Speech. Together with his older brother, he'd fought the worm Hiddelhebi the Black, mother of the red worm, Shuraki that Prester John slew, as well as of Igjarak, the white dragon of the north. So we go again. Inaluki, despite the great deed of slaying Hiddelhebi, became his father's heir under the shadow of Hakrachi's fall. Blaming himself, perhaps, he spent long years in the pursuit of knowledge that likely should have been banned to man and Scythi alike. So, what does he do? He grew the Witchwood Gardens, the place where the Scythi tended the trees. With a strange wood they used as southern men used bronze. The witchwood trees. Inaluki had not forgotten the gardens, nor had he forgotten the dark books he'd read and the shadowy paths he'd walked in search of wisdom. He began a task he thought would be the saving of Asua and the Scythi. He procured black iron, which he gave to the witchwood trees as a monk waters his vine. Many of the trees sickened and died, but one survived. Inaluki wove this tree round with spells, with words older than the Scythi, and charms that reached down farther even than the witchwood's roots. The tree grew strong again, and this time poisonous iron ran through it like blood. Right? The growing of the tree sickened Inaluki, even as it did the gardens themselves, but his will was stronger than any illness. He persevered until it was time to reap the harvest. He took his dreadful planting and went up into the forges of Asua. He watched the master smiths of Asua flee before him and did not care. He heated the forge fires hotter than they'd ever been. He chanted the words of making, all the while wielding the hammer that shapes. Alone in the red-lit depths of the forge, he made a sword, a terrible gray sword whose very substance seemed to breathe dismay. Such hideous, unholy magics did Inaluki call up during its forgings that the very air of Asua seemed to crackle with heat, and the walls swayed as though struck with giant fists. He took his new forged sword and then into his father's great hall, thinking to show his people the thing that would save them. But they ran away, leaving only Inaluki and his father. When the Earl King saw what his son has made, he must have felt his heart turn into ice in his chest, for the blade Inaluki held was no mere weapon, but a blasphemy against the earth that had yielded both iron and witchwood. It was a hole in the tapestry of creation, and life leaked away through it. Such a thing should not be, he told his son. Better that we should go into the forgetful void. Better that the mortals gnaw on our bones. Better even that we had never lived at all than such a thing should ever be made, let alone used. But Inaluki was maddened with the power of the thing and horribly tangled in the spells that created it. It is the one weapon that will save us. Otherwise, these creatures, these insects, will swarm over the face of the land, destroying it as they go, obliterating beauty they cannot see or comprehend. Is it worth any price to prevent that? He ends up killing his father, and he names the blade Jingzhu, which means sorrow. And we get more, he's going to become essentially this terrible spirit which is coming back. And there's one other insight that I want to close on that is quite interesting to consider in this. We're getting it as the Queen of the Scythi, the great ancestor, is telling us about what is going to be happening, what the plan actually is, before she winds up being killed. So we read here, all know what has happened. All know that Inaluki slew his gentle father, that he was unmade at the last, bringing Asua to destruction as he struggled to save himself and all his folks from oblivion. But his fires were so fierce, he could not go peacefully into the shadows beyond life. I curse him for what he did to my husband and his people and himself. But my mother's heart, she is the mother of Inaluki, is still proud. He will not die. My son embraced hatred. It kept him from dying a true death, but it was a flame even hotter than his own, and it has consumed him. There's nothing left of the bright blaze that was my son, almost nothing. He has become something the world has not seen before, a smoldering ember of despair and hatred, surviving only to redress those things which long ago were injustices and mistakes and tragic underestimations, but now are simply facts. Like ourselves, Inaluki dwells in the realm of what was. But unlike his living kin, Inaluki is not content to wallow in memories of the past. He lives or exists. Here is a place the mortal language is too inexact to see the present of the state of the world obliterated and the injustices made right. But his only window is anger. His justice will be cruel, his methods even more horrible. And it's a little bit of a downer to end on, but that's where we'll end this exposition of these first two books of the trilogy, encountering the terrible Dark Lord who threatens all of Osten Ard. But why does he do it? Because of ancient injustices that can't be set right, but he is trying to set right, which doesn't make him a sympathetic character, but should fill us with even greater horror. And we come back to Simon's lament. Is this all for nothing? Well, that's the question that we have to consider, both in the story as we're reading it up till now and in the final book of the trilogy, which we'll talk about in the next session.